So, assalamu alaikum, and thank you for coming, and thank you for being on time. We appreciate that. And now it's with great pleasure that I pass the microphone to my colleague, our young scholar, Dr. Mu'taz Al-Khatib. Yes. So he will moderate the session on Islamic discourse and methodology. So without further ado, I would like to call upon Dr. Mu'taz to take the floor. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Fathi. I think I will speak in Arabic, and Dr. You will speak in French? No. French? So, at least we have one guest will speak in French in this session. So I will moderate this session in Arabic, inshallah. So, هذه الجلسة المفروض بما أني مسؤول عن وحدة المنهجية في مركز دراسات التشريع الإسلامي والأخلاق فهذه الجلسة منتمية إلى هذا المجال حول دراسات المنهجية موضوع هذه الجلسة يدور حول مسألة المرجعية إشكالية المرجعية في الفكر الإسلامي حينما نقول المرجعية هنا فإننا نحيل أمام نوعين من التفكير حول المرجعية. النوع الأول هو إشكالية من يمثل الإسلام.
Who represents Islam? This is a first problem which has a political dimension, representation, and the other use or other concept of discourse is the
بمعنى المرجعية التي تصوغ الأحكام وتبني
Islamic discourse that
التي تمسك بالشرعية
that basically provides rulings and to decide what is licit and illicit. There's a question of epistemology here, and the first one has got a political dimension, whereas we're talking about the epistemological dimension. With regard to the authority or the religious authority, it can be institutions, councils, or people, or perceptions and thoughts.
المرجعية تحيل إلى إشكالات عديدة طبعاً. واحدة منها مسألة هل تصنع المرجعية؟
The question is the authority created, set up, or is it part of the context? It is created within the context. Well, we all know
أننا في الحالة الأولى حينما نقول أن المرجعية
تصنع معنى ذلك أن when we say that the authority is created and set up, it means that there is an intention to somehow create and authorize some kind of an authority, whereas in other situations it is more the context that created it, and this is based on circumstances. The second problem is the diversity of authorities, religious authorities, and therefore we face problems without difference between what is jurisprudence or what is the independent legal interpretation, what is Islamic and what is not in that respect. The third problem is a question of the competition between authorities, religious authorities, and in that case, again, we have the political dimension, and there are many factors that come in play. Some are related to personal dimension, party dimension, or political dimension as well. Now, to begin with, we're going to give the floor to Ahmed Jaballah.
حاليا مدير للمعهد الأوروبي للعلوم الإنسانية
Director of the International Union for Muslim Scholars, and he is also director of the Parisian section of the European Institute of Human Sciences in Paris. Without further ado, the floor is to Mr. Ahmed Jaballah.
وعلى آله وصحبه
In the name of Allah, the Merciful and the Compassionate, peace be upon His Prophet, His beloved Prophet.
I did prepare my speech in Arabic, but the organizers asked me to speak French, which is exactly what I will do. I will say a few words about religious reference in Islam. This is a topic that I will deal with on on the basis of several pillars. First, I'm going to talk about who has the authority in such a specific field. I think that the issue of reference or authority, I did choose the word reference because the word authority could be confused with the word political authority, because here I want to focus on moral authority. So this matter of reference is a general topic that can be found in several fields. What we can say is that we ourselves, each one of us, we do have references, plural, not only one reference, several references that we need in terms of religion. That is a fact. As the Imam says, the attitude of a Muslim vis-à-vis his own actions can be found in a book where it says, citation en arabe, it's the chapter of signs that should precede words and actions. Can we, when we talk about religious reference in the field of Islam, can we talk about one reference only or several references? Question mark. One can talk about several references because it's not only that one reference only is valid for all Muslims, and we all know that, but we can also see that some people can have at the same time several references. How can we define the religious reference in Islam? Just to give you a simple and clear definition, one can say that reference will be a person or an institution. One can also say that an institution is a reference, and you go to this person or this institution in order to get an opinion, or for this person or this institution to make a choice. And if you are being faced with several choices, you have to choose your reference in order to be enlightened and assisted in our choice. The religious reference that can be represented by a learned person, by a preacher, by a mufti, has an opinion. And this is very important. Learned Muslims have always said that there is a difference between the statute of the mufti, who only proposes an opinion, and the statute of the judge, the magistrate. Citation en arabe. The judge, when he renders an opinion, it will actually be rendered as a decision. The mufti will propose an opinion, and up to you to follow it or not. Now, what are the specific, what is the specific nature of the Muslim reference? If we go back to the Quran, I did find 3 indications that can shed some light on what we mean by a credible reference. First, we have knowledge, science. Knowledge is to be found in this reference, because what you find in the field of law may be different from what you find elsewhere. And in our religion, we also have several disciplines. But if you look at the Quran, 1643, so ask the people of reputable knowledge if you know not. This has been interpreted as those who have the knowledge. The second thing is expertise or experience. That can be considered as an added value to knowledge. It means that you need to have a practical experience. The Quran 25:59 asks now of the wise concerning him. Yes, some people do have the knowledge, they do have the scientific knowledge, but what they lack is the practical experience of things, experience in the field. And the third one is the capacity to draw some deductions. And here, the Quran 483, if they only had referred it to the messenger or to those charged with authority among them, the proper investigators would have understood it from them. In other words, you've got this competence. How can you draw conclusions on the basis of text? How can you have ijtihad vis-à-vis a precise fact in a precise circumstance? Now, the various types of Islamic references, I would say that there are several types of references. First, we have the fiqh, the case law. Generally speaking, it's the most important reference because the Mufti, or the learned person who will give this religious opinion, is generally the person you go to when you want to know what the standard is, the norm is, or the law is on a very precise issue. Or you want to know his opinion about some action. And then you've got the educative or the educational reference in the spiritual sense of the word. You find some references that are, well, they don't necessarily have the right knowledge in terms of fiqh, but they are spiritual tutors. The duat, those who preach, they are not necessarily people who are specialized in religious sciences, but they do have a certain moral authority and they do represent a certain reference. And then you've got the political reference, because for some Islamic movements that have in their program political activities, those political references are important. But you have to make a distinction between those types of reference, because often for the ordinary Muslim there is some confusion. The preacher who will be well known, we know preachers who have become, thanks to television or thanks to the internet, we know some preachers who have become stars, and sometimes they will be asked to give a legal opinion about fiqh, but they don't really have the competence or the jurisdiction to render an opinion in this field. And for those who present themselves as being political leaders, they can have, I would say, an Islamic discourse, but they may not be specialized in the law or in the fiqh. So it is important to make a distinction between the various types of references. But it's not always easy, of course. What are the elements that actually compose this reference? I would say that first you have the level of knowledge. This is actually an issue that was dealt with in the introduction. How is a reference being constructed? Is it a matter of environment, or is it a reference that's being constructed gradually? Well, of course, the first thing is the level of knowledge, because one can see very clearly that if you do want to impose a reference at the end of the day, you find yourself without a reference, because a reference cannot be imposed by power. A reference will actually come out naturally on the basis of his or her competencies and on the basis of his level of knowledge, but also on the basis of his capacity to communicate. I mean, we all know very famous muftis or learned people, and they know a lot, but they can't really communicate properly. And we live today in a world where communication is so important. So having the knowledge is not enough. You need to communicate this knowledge. And then you've got the communication means that will be put at the disposal of this reference. We know many specialists, experts, they know a lot, but they never had the opportunity to be given the means to communicate. And then you can see others, they have maybe less knowledge, but they have the opportunity to access the media. And today we all know how important the internet is. I mean, this is the great challenge of today. And this is also important in terms of reference. And then, of course, you've got the statute and the religious role or function. This is a bit more official. The statute, the official statute of this reference will have an impact on what is being communicated. I would say that the religious Muslim reference for the Muslims in Europe is as follows. For Muslims in Europe, one can talk about several references. Sometimes they run in parallel. First, you've got the moral authority of the imam or the preacher who lives next door to you, in the same region, in the same city. He's a local reference. Now, it depends how credible he is, of course, but you've got this local reference you can go to. Then you've got the national reference today. The experience of Muslims in the various countries in Europe is to try to pool and coordinate between the various imams and the various muftis in order to have a council. In France, we've got federations with the Darab Fatwa, for example. So we try to pool those references. We want to have a kind of a council that can debate on important issues and give a collective opinion, because today we are being faced with highly complex issues, and often, I mean, you may be as learned as you may be, but on your own it wouldn't be enough, so you need to consult with other people, hence the importance of a collective reference. We also have the European reference. It's the CEFR. We've got this European Council. They've actually organized over 24 sessions. They have a very important legal and intellectual production, but they are not sufficiently known in the Muslim community. That's very unfortunate. I mean, they should communicate a bit more. And then at the international level, we've got the fiqh academies. And let me end on the issues that concern the religious Muslim reference. First, it must be said that we've got several sources of references, and today we have this additional challenge of the electronic reference. Today, it's so easy. You have a question, you go to the jargon, as we say today. It's the internet. Internet is everywhere today, and it is a huge challenge. And then you've got the level of the knowledge of the Muslim and its impact on the choice of his reference. Because what are the criteria that you will use in order to choose your reference? Is it the preacher who will be eloquent enough, or is it because this person will be very well known, or is it because this person really has the competence in the field where you want to have an opinion? And then you've got this reference between the sovereignty of sources and the referent himself. Will you actually guide people towards the opinion that you chose, or will you also enlighten this person if people are of a diverse opinion? And then you've got this individual authority, the Mufti, and the collective authority, which is a council for a fatwa. So the idea is to actually really focus properly on the right issues. And so you've got this local reference, you've got this national reference. Oh, sorry, says the speaker, we've gone back here one slide. So it is, of course, difficult to take on board all those various dimensions. The imams, the muftis are being faced with very complex issues. So the answer doesn't only depend on the knowledge that you have of the fiqh, but there are social dimensions, psychological dimensions to the issue. And then you've got the Islamic reference and the variety of interpretations and the need to unify or to unite the fatwa. You know, we are in favor of diversity in this matter of fatwa, but there are issues that touch upon the general organization of the practical religious life of Muslims, and there we need to have a united legal opinion. And then you've got this difference between universality and the environment, the context in which you are. So those who present themselves as references or reference have a huge responsibility. Let me remind you what was said, citation en arabe. Those are the signatories signing in the name of God. So they have to respect the field of competence. They have to understand properly the questions that are being put forward, and they have to be sincere and be in fear of God. And you have also the responsibility of the person who chooses the reference. What are the rules for the person who is looking for a reference? You need scientific and objective criteria in choosing the reference. You've got to understand the opinion that's being given, and you've got to have a critical attitude. And then I would like to end on a few quotes. Citation en arabe. You've got the responsibility in the choice of the reference. So if you want to choose a reference, you've got three criteria to choose between. Citation en arabe. You have to go back to the person who will be the most competent in scientific matters, but in his time and in his country. Thank you for your attention.
شكرا دكتور جاب الله. المتحدث الثاني هو دكتور جوناثان براون. دكتور جوناثان براون يعمل أستاذا بجامعة جورجتاون كلية الشؤون الدولية حيث يشغل منصب أستاذ كرسي الوليد بن طلال للحضارة الإسلامية وهو أيضا المدير المشارك لمركز الوليد بن طلال للتفاهم الإسلامي والسياسي. سيتحدث جوناثان براون ما الذي يجعل الفتوى مقنعة اليوم؟ الدليل والمرجعية في عصر الخصام السياسي.
And he will talk as well about evidence and authority in an age of political controversy. So 20 minutes. The floor is yours. In the name of God, the merciful and the compassionate, peace be upon our Prophet.
To the organizers for inviting me and for putting on this tremendous conference. I've already learned a great deal. I was going to give my presentation in Klingon, but they asked me to do it in English. Come on, that's what's a good joke, people. That was actually a good joke. Okay, this is a really interesting topic that I was given, and I realized as I was preparing that it's a huge topic that there's no way I'm going to be able to do justice to, but I'll do my best to summarize it. I want to start out just by reminding you of a very famous fatwa. It's called the Transvaal Fatwa. It was given by the then Mufti of Egypt, Sheikh Mohammed Abdu, in 1903. One of the statements made in the fatwa was that it was acceptable for Muslims to eat the meat of the people of the book, killed by people of the book, even if if those animals were slaughtered in ways that directly contradicted the Quran. For example, the Quran prohibits eating animals that have been killed by stunning them on the head. Whereas what Muhammad Abdu said in this fatwa is that if a Christian or a Jew kills an animal in a way that's acceptable to that community, even if he kills it in a way that's stunning it on the head, Muslims can still eat it. Now, this was a very controversial fatwa, and Muhammad Abdu was really criticized heavily during his lifetime. He died only 2 years after he gave this fatwa, and this fatwa really took a toll on him, on his health, on his public persona, and he really died kind of a broken man, in part because of the response to this fatwa by scholars and the popular audience as well, kind of the population of Egypt. But the reason I bring this up is because today, many people, many Muslims around the world actually accept this fatwa. They actually, many Muslims in the United States, for example, don't even think about the meat they eat. They just, it's in America. America's a Christian country, and they just eat it, and they don't even think about it. And even though they know very well that that meat has been killed in a way that's directly contradictory to the Quran. So it's an interesting case of the life of a fatwa, which I just want to give as an example in the beginning. The main question that we're asking today is where does authority come from in Islam? And the answer is pretty easy. The authority comes from the Quran and the Sunnah of the Prophet. But these sources are always mediated. They're always mediated by the ulama. Because what does the Quran mean? What does the Sunnah mean? How do we understand them in particular times and places? These questions are not clear. The answers are not clear. And they have to be answered by the inheritors of the prophets, the heirs of the prophets, namely the ulama. So the ulama will always act as mediators for these sources. And because these mediators disagree in their interpretations, you have tremendous diversity in the Islamic tradition. That diversity is settled today in basically 7 or 8 madhabs, depending if you consider the Zahiri madhab to be a madhab, the 4 Sunni schools, Zaydi Shi'ism, Imami Shi'ism, Ibadi Islam, and Zahiri Islam. So these all, I know this seems kind of controversial, but these are all authentic representations of the Quran and the Sunnah. People who believe in each one of these schools believe this is an authentic representation of the Quran and the Sunnah. And because Muslims in general consider these schools all to lie within the pale of Islam, they are all, in effect, accurate representations of the Quran and the Sunnah. How do the ulama actually manifest their authority in the lives of Muslims? Well, in one sense, and this is not so much a reality today, but certainly historically it was, they acted as people who resolve disputes amongst individuals in mundane matters or in serious matters. Namely, they acted as judges in Sharia courts. And the second part was to act as guides to Muslims in their private affairs. So if a Muslim wanted to know the answer to a question about what to do or what to believe, they could ask a qualified scholar who would then give them the answer. That was a non-binding answer. This was merely guidance, and this was the scholar acting in the capacity as a mufti. Now, in both cases, the ulama are seeking the maslahah, the welfare of the Muslim population, both in this life and the afterlife. In the case of the mufti acting as a judge, the maslahah is in an important way achieved by simply providing a predictable legal system, a predictable system in which you know if you're going to go to court that a certain rule is going to be applied. Now, what happened was, if people went to court and it was clear that that rule was going to lead to an unjust result, a lot of times, and this is true throughout Islamic civilization, very often you'd find the judge taking a ruling, let's say, from another madhab or a minority ruling from that judge's madhab in order to provide a result that was more just and more pursuant to the welfare of the Muslims. In the case of the mufti, you have 2 different kinds of fatwas. One is just a general fatwa. So somebody writes to me and says, am I permitted to worship 2 gods? No. Okay, that's it. Answer's easy. And you see a lot of times, especially in the Ottoman Empire, the Ottoman period, these very, very brief fatwas answered by the Sheikh al-Islam and other senior scholars. But you could also have a fatwa that was very personalized fatwa, that was addressing a specific question for a specific person who was talking about the specific characteristics of their situation. And in this case, the principle which applied was that madhab al-ami, madhab al-mufti. What does that mean? Madhab al-ami, madhab al-mufti. The mufti actually can choose from their own school of law. They can choose alternative rulings from their own school of law. They can choose from outside their school of law based on either what they feel is the best evidence or what meets the needs of the person asking the fatwa. And especially if there's a case of necessity, that the mufti can provide the answer that is going to help the person seeking the answer in this situation of necessity. Now, the reason why the principle that the madhab of the person asking is the madhab of the mufti applies is that the person asking isn't asking for what the proper madhab ruling is. They're asking what the proper ruling in the eyes of God is. What's the proper ruling from the Islamic perspective? And because the mufti is seeking the maslahah, the best interest of this individual in this life and the next life, the mufti can actually draw on the entire breadth of the Islamic tradition in giving the answer. Okay. So what about the question of what makes a scholar authoritative? How do we know what makes a scholar convincing? What makes somebody want to follow that scholar or take that scholar's opinion seriously? Well, ideally, obviously, that the scholar represents or manifests a mastery of the Quran and the Sunnah, that the scholar is an inheritor of the previous generations of scholars, going all the way back to the companions of the Prophet, ﷺ, to the Prophet himself, and to the revelation of God. But that's an ideal. Let's think maybe a little bit more cynically or realistically about what makes a scholar, what makes them heeded amongst the population, what makes an audience listen to a scholar and take their opinion seriously. One factor could be the piety, the personal piety, the barakah of that person, their reputation. A good example here from the Twelver Shiite tradition is Mirza Shirazi, who's the sole, what's called marja taqlid in the Shiite tradition at the time. He died in 1895 of the Common Era. And in 1891, he gave an extremely influential fatwa in Iran, which was that Iranians could not smoke tobacco because the Iranian Shah had given the concession of producing tobacco to the British. And so the Shirazi said, actually, it's now prohibited to smoke tobacco because this is basically giving power to foreigners, to non-Muslims. And actually, the massive part of the population in Iran followed the fatwa. In fact, even the family of the Shah himself stopped smoking tobacco, and the tobacco concession was withdrawn. And this is because of the tremendous reputation of Mirza Shirazi. Maybe the person's nasab, the person's claim to sort of some genealogy of religious genealogy or pious genealogy, or the religious capital of an individual or an institution. And you see this certainly in the case of institutions like Al-Azhar or Deoband, Darul Uloom Deoband in India, that these institutions for generations and generations, in some cases centuries, have built up kind of a tradition of piety and respect and of scholarship, and that they merit or warrant a certain degree of respect simply based on that accumulated religious capital. Now, as I was trying to think of these factors, this one kept coming into my mind over and over again, that the Mufti manifests what the audience believes to be correct. And this kind of throws a curve at us, because what this is saying is that it's not really the Mufti who is correct, it's the audience who believes the Mufti is correct. It's when the Mufti's opinion matches the opinion of the audience that the Mufti is correct. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. We see this in the case of Ahmed ibn Hanbal, rahimahullah, the famous 9th century scholar, because what gave him tremendous authority and power amongst the population of Baghdad was the fact that he held positions, like, for example, the Quran was not, that the Quran was eternal. He held this position despite pressure from the government, and this made the masses respect him, right? So they respected him because he held the position that they agreed with. Okay. This factor is very cynical. What about political backing? To what extent does the backing of the state or of the government make a Mufti authoritative or make a scholar authoritative? That I want to get back to. But I think that if we look at these, sorry, I want to go back here. If we look at these 4, or certainly the top 3 factors, actually the first 2, piety and religious capital, they're actually created by the 3rd one. What makes somebody's reputation? What gives someone religious capital? It's the fact that time after time, or repeatedly, they demonstrate to their audience that they are correct, that they are ruling by what the Quran and the Sunnah really says. But if what the Quran and the Sunnah really say is determined by the scholars, but the scholars' correctness is determined by whether the audience agrees with them, what this says is it's in fact the masses of the Muslims who give the Mufti their authority. It's in fact the masses of the Muslims, the jama'ah of Muslims, that determine whether a mufti is authoritative and determine what the correct understanding of the Quran and the Sunnah is. So in a way, it's not the ulama who are the leaders of the masses, but the ulama are also dependent on the approval of the masses for their authority. And that there's a tension, there's a balance between that. The ulama can lead the masses, but the ulama cannot lead the masses in such a way that it pulls them away from what the masses are convinced is the correct understanding of Islam. And just to give you an example of this, to get ahead of myself, but to give you an example, Sheikh Muhammad al-Ghazali, the famous Egyptian scholar who died in 1996, very well respected, beloved in Egypt. His books continue to sell in thousands and thousands of copies. Man of tremendous integrity, tremendous courage. When he gave he said in he gave a fatwa basically. He said in a public setting that women can lead prayer. And can lead men in prayer. If you have a woman who's more knowledgeable than a man, she can lead the men in prayer. Most people don't even know about this because no one ever listened to this opinion. No one ever followed this opinion because even the authority of Muhammad al-Ghazali, even his piety, was not going to pull the Egyptian population off their position on that issue. Okay, this is a fascinating study done by my teacher, one of my teachers, Muzaffar, from the Taba Foundation in Abu Dhabi. And so you can get it online. It's very interesting. Elements of fatwa and their contribution to confidence and validity. This is basically polling done on a selection of Muslims. What makes them believe a fatwa? What makes a fatwa compelling or convincing to them? And what you see is that by far the most convincing element, I think I can't read it from here, 94.4%, is that it comes from a known, reputable mufti or fatwa institution. That's far more important than stating the supporting textual evidence from the Quran and the Sunnah. It's far more important than explaining the supporting textual evidence. It's far, and this is going to really annoy us scholars in the audience, it's really a lot more important than referencing earlier works of law. And it makes all the ulama very sad. But that's very unconvincing, only 66.7%. The most important thing is the reputation of the mufti. But the reputation of the mufti is, in an important sense, made by the extent to which the mufti meets the expectations of the population. I got increasingly upset as I was preparing for this presentation because I started to realize there's really interesting questions that I didn't have any answers to. And I wanted to, for example, if you think of famous fatwas, what makes these fatwas convincing? It would be really interesting to go back and look at very controversial fatwas or even not controversial fatwas and see what made Muslims either follow or not follow these fatwas. In the case of the Transvaal Fatwa of Muhammad Abdu, what's interesting is that initially the fatwa is really pilloried. I mean, it is very strongly rejected across the board almost by all Muslim scholars. And by the way, Muhammad Abdu was not only an agent of the Egyptian government, he was an agent of the British at the time. So the Egyptian population said, absolutely not. This guy is a sellout. We don't accept his fatwa. But over time, the fatwa is accepted. Is that because Muhammad Abdu's argument was good? And in fact, you see that over the decades, even really conservative Salafi scholars like Sheikh Ahmed Shakir, who died in 1958, who you'd think hate Muhammad Abdu, they actually talk about how much they respected his contributions to the revival of Azhar, to the revival of the study of the Quran. So is it that Muhammad Abdu's reputation actually was stronger than we thought and it was able to convince people of his fatwa? Or is it the fact that Muhammad Abdu has until today been the darling of the Egyptian state? And I think, if I'm not mistaken, in the current Egyptian constitution, which is the most ridiculous thing I've ever seen in my life, excuse my French, the current Egyptian constitution, in the beginning, it actually mentions Muhammad Abdu as one of the kind of heroes of the Egyptian nation, along with all the singers and dancers who wrote the Constitution. But sorry about the kind of, okay. So he's been consistently supported by the Egyptian establishment and by the Egyptian state. So what is it that makes his fatwa convincing in Egypt and beyond? If we think about Muhammad Abdu's fatwas on sculpture, that sculpture and representative art are acceptable as long as we don't worship them. These were also very controversial fatwas in their times, but they've since been widely accepted. Are they widely accepted because their arguments are good, or are they widely accepted because they justify an Islam that is much more accommodating of global Western norms and global Western artistic sensibilities? I don't know the answer to that. When you think about, I think when you look at less political fatwas, or less consistently political fatwas, like let's say, is photography allowed? I think probably my guess is most people in this room think photography is allowed. I hope it is because there's a big picture of me up here, right? I hope it is. But most people think it is, but I don't think, very few people probably know where that argument came from. Who is the mufti or the scholar that they're basing that opinion on? I think when an issue wins out just on its merits, oftentimes no one remembers who the mufti was who made that argument, or who the mufti was who makes the counter-argument. When it comes to me shutting up now, which I will do, I think the question to keep in mind is, to what extent can Muslims make decisions about the merits of an argument about their religion? To what extent can they make a decision based on the merits of an argument and separate it from political and social considerations? I think that's a very, I can't actually think of an instance where I can do that. And I think it just shows how trying and tense the times Muslims have lived in for the past 150 years and continue to live in are. Thanks very much.
شكرا جوناثان براون.
Thank you very much,
سأجعل آخر المتحدثين دكتور هبة رؤوف ليس لي أغراض ليس لي هدف جندر مرتبط بالجندر وإنما مرتبط بحسب الموضوع وسيكون ختامها مسك إن شاء الله. المتحدث الثالث هو دكتور العربي البشري
Mr. Alarbi Becheri,
يشغل حاليا منصب المدير العلمي للمعهد الأوروبي للعلوم
Director of the Islamic Studies in France.
وهو أستاذ الدراسات العليا في هذا الفرع أيضا.
Professor and head of this department in this university, and the floor is given to Alarbi Becheri. So the floor is yours without any further delay.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله الصلاة والسلام على رسول الله وعلى آله وصحبه ومن والاه.
In the name of Allah,
Donc,
merciful.
moi aussi, comme Sheikh Ahmed, j'ai préparé mon sujet en arabe.
I did prepare my topic in Arabic, but
entendre le français.
apparently our audience would like to hear me in French. I'm afraid my French is not terribly good, but inshallah I will try to actually communicate properly. My topic is a bit more technical. I shall be speaking about the fatwa, but why am I choosing to deal with fatwa in a more technical way? Let me explain. In fact, the content of the fatwa is something that isn't really well perceived by, shall I say, normal people, but I mean standard people by that. And this reference issue is, look, in the field of medicine, you are not going to go and see a cardiologist if you have an issue with your eyes. I mean, everybody knows that you will need to see an eye specialist. So why is it that if we do have a religious issue, we will go to anybody to ask a question? But that's because standard people may not know exactly what a fatwa is. Hence my idea, which is to deconstruct fatwa. Quote in Arabic. What is a fatwa? Look at any fatwa. Let me take a very simple example. I ask the question, or somebody asked me the question, do I have to make zakat? I said yes. Now, for you, it may be fairly simple, and maybe you will be able to formulate an answer because zakat, we know what it is in our religion. But my answer will be actually based on other forms of hukum, that is to say, the first hukum, which is the obligation, hukum taklifi, that is to say, the law as an injunction, where the Mufti will have to check on the law as a declaration. When Allah prescribes something, there is this prescription that is an injunction, but on the other hand, the reasons are being given why this hukum, or how this law should be used in the life of people. So the two are being given at the same time. And that is why it is so important for the Mufti to check whether this person who asked the question actually has the nisab. Also, you need to check whether a year has elapsed in order to check whether this person is rich enough and does it need this sum of money for a year. And then you have to check whether this person has debts to repay or not. So that is a lot of work. And today, if having a nisab, what does it mean? It means this person is rich. But being rich today, is it the same as being rich years ago? If you say somebody is rich, is it because he's got 85 grams of gold? Because you can have 85 grams of gold, so that would be about 2,000 euros, but you can have 2,000 euros as well. But that's all you have, and it doesn't mean that you are rich. You see what I mean? That is the work that's got to be carried out by the Mufti. And if you want to deconstruct this work, it is going to be based on two types of efforts. Quote in Arabic. First, there will be two efforts to be made. The first effort will be to infer a statute on the basis of the text. It can be a law, an injunction, it can be a declaration. But after that, you will have to check and to engage into an expertise of the questions that are being asked, and the person will have to see whether the statute can be applied or not applied, that has been inferred on the basis of the text. So you can see that there is a statute, I call it injunction, and then you've got this declaration, sabab wa shab, and so on and so forth. You have to check, in other words, that there is a reason, a condition, and that there is no impeachment, so to speak, if I may say it like this. So those are two sorts of ijtihad, and they have nothing to do, in fact. What do I mean by this? Well, the only thing that the Mufti will do, he will put the two ijtihads into relation, but the essence of those two ijtihads is very different, one from the other. The first one is being based on the reading of the text, and the second is being based on the reading of the question that's being asked and the legal nature of the situation. As it happens, the first ijtihad, maybe in the past it was the most difficult one because the text was new, religious text was something new. It was very new for the first Muslims who had to do this type of work. So we made a lot of efforts, and that, I mean, in order to have the proper instruments, and this instrument has been properly constructed. It is what it is today, and learned people, scholars in the past who used to be legal specialists, actually mastered everything. But for the second one, it's something that actually happened in their imagination, in their thoughts. And few scholars in the past explained and detailed this type of ijtihad. And today, that's the problem, because we don't really have an instrument that is as detailed as the first ijtihad. So this ijtihad, which is Ghazali is telling us what the instruments are, and he probably is the only one who tried to actually open up in Asas el-Qiyas. He's talking about the instruments to be used in this type of ijtihad. I think he's the first one to have done that. But those instruments have got nothing to do with the text. As Al-Ghazali says, I mean, those instruments, this type of ijtihad is based on the reason, purely and simply. First, on what we call al-Bahaim, that is to say, syllogism and so on and so forth, and the direct instrument, which is the meaning. The reason, he is quoting 5 things: meaning, reason, but also the nature of things. The Mufti sometimes has to look into the nature of things, and then, what did I say? Yes, the reason, the meaning, the nature, and then al-urf, that is to say the use, the usage, and then you've got the language, the terminology that is being used in the text. And you've got to know whether, when the name is being given in the text, can you just verify that it can be used for this situation or that situation? That's something, that's a work that needs to be carried out. So one can see that this form of ijtihad is an ijtihad that actually is all about human assessment. And of course, since the environment in the past used to be fairly simple, it was fairly simple to assess things. If the environment is simple, you don't need all those capacities, extraordinary talents in order to check upon things and in order to assess things. That is what we call the determinant of the norm, and that's what I call the law, the injunction. But today the situation is different. Ghazali is saying that this form of ijtihad, which is the second ijtihad, represents 9/10 of the fiqh in Islam. That is to say that the ijtihad that was constructed, that's being governed by the fundaments of the Islamic law, represents 1/10 of the fiqh. Whereas the 9/10, that's the human dimension. Right? This means that the legislation, the major part of the legislation is being given to the human beings. 9/10 of the fiqh is human. It's about human assessment that prevails. So if you go back to today, in our days and age, I mean, well, we've been going through an extraordinary evolution in every sense of the word. I mean, the man of today is certainly not what the man was before. I mean, communication means have changed, transport, the way we go from one location to another has changed, and everything has become so complex. In the past, for example, in order to analyze, say, the psychology of human psychology, well, it was fairly simple. Today, psychology has become a genuine science, so to speak. In the past, in order to analyze a societal phenomenon, well, you could do that with simple instruments because our society was fairly simple as well. Today, it has become quite scientific. I mean, analyzing a societal phenomenon has become quite scientific. So, I mean, Al-Ghazali is quoting 5 points, and those are the instruments that the tools that you can use in order to determine whether the norm is applicable or not. So why is it not translated today into sciences? If you talk about Raouf, for example, sometimes you are being faced with somebody who doesn't know the history of a country, doesn't know the way people think, doesn't know what the imaginary of a society is, and what happens in the collective memory of a country. So how do you want this person to actually shift from an individual vision towards a vision that's being based on a real science with criteria that is well determined? So it can be replaced by sociology, for example. That's a science that is far more elaborate today. And the same goes for anything to do with nature. And this is something that we are starting to do already. But we still have this will to go back to the learned individual. But given the complexity of things, and my predecessor said this also, certainly as far as questions are that govern a whole of a community or a society, one can ill afford to put his trust in one individual only, because things are far too complex today. Things are so complex today. What does it mean? It means that in our fiqh, for example, we cannot put the 9/10 of our fiqh in the hands of one person only. I mean, that is not possible. Simple as that. We have to actually use something else, that is to say a fatwa that is based on consultation, something that's been produced by a college of people. You will find the scholars, the learned people in this group, and they master the text, but maybe they're not very good at assessing the environment. I mean, you can't ask somebody today to be a specialist in everything. I mean, that's not possible anymore. I mean, we have to be so specialized these days, and you can't put that sort of things into the hands of one person only. So this type of ijtihad should be actually put into the hands of several people. Thank you for your attention.
شكرا للدكتور العربي البشري.
Thank you very much to Mr.
الآن المداخلة الأخيرة في هذه الجلسة هي مداخلة الدكتورة هبة رؤوف
will be delivered by Madam Heba Raouf Ezzat, and she is coordinator of the Civil Society Program and Research in Cairo, and she is also working at the Cairo of University. She will deal about something which is similar to the authorities and religious references. She will talk what is beyond the Islamic State. She will talk about democracy's discontent at the future and the future of the world in 15 minutes.
First of all, I would like to thank those who invited me, Dr. Tariq, Ramadan, and the group of the center. And also the Network for Muslims, European Muslims. And I would like to first situate myself in the panel, so that I wouldn't look odd why I am talking about politics, why most of what has been done so far is talking about fatwa. But actually, politicians make their own fatwas as well, but not in the name of God, but in the name of sovereignty. And people receive these fatwas not only as ijtihad of the politician, but as orders of a new God, which is the state. And this is not my analysis, it's the analysis that has been basically adapted by me from the work or the words of Bertrand Russell when he said that what modernity did, what the Enlightenment and then modernity did, was to replace God with the state. So if we apply this and make some analogies, it would be very interesting. This is how I want to approach what I'm going to say. And the second thing is that I wanted to focus very much on the ethical because of the nature of the platform and the hosts of the events. So the ethical and the moral should come into the discussion as well. And I will just tell a very small short story. I was one of the co-founders of Islam Online, a website that was active from 1999 to 2009, 2010, and then it stopped for some reasons I don't want to talk about now. And one of the things in the board of Islam Online was sitting with the section of fatwa. And they were very happy that increasingly visitors of the website were coming to ask for fatwa from different parts of the world. And so we had all these sheets showing that we are now receiving questions from New Zealand, from South Africa, even from some Latin American countries. And the measure of success for the Department of Fatwa in the website, that was in English and Arabic as well, was how many people started asking questions. And the measure of success for me, and this was my concern, that actually if those people are frequent visitors of the website, the number of those who pose questions should start minimizing. Because the fatwa as a process between al-mufti wal-mustafti, the person who is asking and the person who is answering, is also educational. So what comes out of that is in the course of time, I should ask less and be able myself to look into the text myself and be aware of the different dimensions of practicing my own Islam. As Dr. Ahmed Jaballah mentioned, it's very important to remember, اسألوا أهل الذكر إن كنتم لا تعلمون. Ask those who are knowledgeable if you don't have the knowledge. But also in the Quran, God says, وَلَقَدْ يَسَّرْنَا الْقُرْآنَ لِلذِّكْرِ فَهَلْ مِن مُدَّكِرٍ. We facilitated this text to be accessible to those who are looking for knowledge. So is there anybody who is looking for wisdom and knowledge and looking into the text? So it's actually from both sides. And this is a relation of power. And this relation of power is the base upon which I'm going to build my argument regarding what fallacies we are facing when we talk about the Islamic State or Islam and politics, because it is non-existent, basically, in our modern times. The state, when it took over the mission of being the speaker in the name of God in the process of secularization and taking away the independence of the scholarly entity, and this politicization that Jonathan mentioned, the political dimensions of fatwa increasingly, most of the institutions, at least in the Sunni world now, are part and parcel of the state. What happened is, where was the space where actually people can talk about religion and take it away from the authority of the state and talk in the name of the people? These were the Muslim or the Islamic movements that emerged by the beginning of the 20th century to face the dilemma of the fall of the caliphate. So now we have the emergence and rise of the nation state that started in the 19th century in many Arab and Islamic countries. And we have the fall of the caliphate by the beginning of the 20th century. And then where do people turn to if they want to ask for fatwa regarding life and politics and the day after and everything? And the ulama increasingly lost the trust, which is their capital, that the three speakers talked about. So what emerged at the time, people who claimed that they are now speaking in the name of the Ummah, these are the Islamic movements, and they spread all over the Muslim world. I can talk more about the Muslim Brothers because I come from Egypt, so I know the case a bit more, but it was not the only case. It spread horizontally across the Muslim world, but we also had witnessed different Islamic groups coming up, and they actually sort of adopted scholars who became, in the eyes of people, part and parcel of this phenomena. So we have in Egypt, for example, Sheikh Said Sabiq, we have Abdul Qadir Ouda as a scholar of Islamic law, we have different people who started talking about the Islamic project on the platform of the Islamic movements and were listened to by people, not because they belonged to the groups, but because they were scholars. And increasingly, this voice of scholars within the movement declined until we reached the end of the 20th century, where the voice was the voice of the technocrats and the voice of the politicians within the movements. And this has its own manifestations. That's why people started turning to completely individual symbols like Amr Khalid or Mustafa Hosni or Mu'taz Mas'ud in the case of Egypt, for example. I can name others in the case of Morocco or in Syria or in Turkey or in other places, but now people wanted to turn to someone whom they can trust, who doesn't talk too much sophisticated fiqh, but who looks simple, modern, and who would give them incentive to be good Muslims in a very complex and modern world that Dr. Al-Arabi described. A very difficult mission to construct your own self and to construct your own understanding of yourself with a capital S. So I want a simple, the situation is complex, so I want someone who's giving me a very simple discourse about that. That was actually something like, I don't like to say that, but it's one of the descriptions we use in social sciences, like new Islamic Protestantism. You know, it's like these Protestant ethics type going along modernity and neo-capitalism type sort of statements and talks and books and visual productions that you can follow on your Twitter account, or this liquid Islam that has no constitution of a very solid nature. What does this have to do with politics? It has to do a lot, because where do we now take the imagination of what is political and how we construct our Islamic identity within the realm of politics from? As a Muslim now, when I grow up now in the Muslim world, if I'm 18, like my own daughters and my son, where do I turn to construct not only my identity as a Muslim, but also my agency as a political agent? Where do I take from the notions of justice, equality? What should I do now in the chaotic situation of the Arab world? Whose side should I take in Syria, in Egypt, in Tunisia? What meaning should I make out of this world? And I think that this is a good starting point to link what has been said with what I want to say. Okay, so we have a problem that the frame of reference that we all on the platform go back to is Islam. But at the same time, political scientists, myself, have to confess that our own frame of reference is modernity. This is how the social sciences mind has been secularized over the many decades. And what actually captures our imagination as social scientists is methodological modernism. Methodology itself and theory itself, by which we actually understand the world and analyze phenomena, etc., is very much secularized and is very much modernized. And this is a challenge, not only a challenge to build a proper understanding and a political imaginary of an Islamic nature, because all the time I realize that my mind has been constructed in a secular way, even if I have all the good intentions to be a good Muslim and think about an Islamic understanding of the world or take an Islamic position, etc., regarding politics, but also because this is an obstacle towards building a political theory based on Islamic understanding. What is the dilemma? The dilemma is that in modernity and in the modern thinking, the state is the moral agent. You are now not responsible anymore for your morality and ethics. The state is the one, the sovereign is the one that judges about morality and ethics, and you have to obey. And there is no way, this is my understanding of Islam, because I have a bit of understanding, there is no way that you can delegate your moral and ethical responsibility to any entity, including even the Khalifa if you are in an Islamic political system. There is always that sense of moral agency and individual responsibility of what you believe is haqq. And this is the dilemma sometimes even within the Islamic groups, because if you are aware of the dynamism of power within the Islamic groups, the political movements, if you disagree with the Jama'ah, for example, then you are shunned out. Then you are somehow less devoted. Then you are not practicing proper Islam. And then either you are marginalized or you are called whatever names, as much as heretic and, was done within previous religious frames. Now you are also a heretic in a way. Or the easiest thing that they can call you is you are a secularist. And this is like you are a kafir, it's based on the culture within these groups. So where do we derive our political imagination from? And this is the problem. It has been overwhelmingly affected by the presence of the modern state in our culture, in our upbringing, and in our understanding of our own faith. This methodological modernism has to be challenged. And the first potential and the first opportunity is to challenge it based on ethics and morality, and reclaim this moral agency of the individual and of the jama'ah, of the wider ummah, as a social entity, and challenge the state of being a moral agent, and then we see what comes out of that. It's interesting that people have been talking increasingly about an Islamic state, and interestingly enough, less and less about Khilafah. So even ISIS called itself the Islamic State. And state means state. They are really acting like a state. I don't want to go into Daesh issue and ISIS and how we should assess it, but it looks very much like a state. And it looks also very much modern. It uses excessive violence, the images of brutality. And it's interesting that in the video that was broadcasted regarding the massacre of the Egyptian Copts in Libya, one of the sentences that were mentioned by the person who's saying now we are sort of killing those people because of this and that, he said, Sayyidina Muhammad bu'itha bis-sayfi rahmatan lil-alamin. And many people in Egypt did not understand the sentence in the first place, because as-sayf went into the bu'ithu rahmatan lil-alamin, and now bu'ithu rahmatan lil-alamin bis-sayf. So it's actually the person, either he was told to say something that he doesn't understand at all, or it was meant to be said. So that a new formula of what rahmah means, merged with the sword, is a new introduction of what the Islamic State is about, and then to sort of deter people and make people say, we don't want this. We just want a bit of rahmah, which is not present anymore in whatever Islamic politics is presented. And this is very interesting. Does this mean that we have to think about politics in terms of liberalism and democracy to save our understanding of Islam from this distortion in a way? I think that this is not the case. I think, on the contrary, we should look into the notions of democracy and republicanism in the very essential manner. If we are reclaiming the concepts of shura, like Professor Al-Arabi mentioned, shura here is not only the shura of ulama, that we have ijtihad jama'i, collective fatwa and collective ijtihad, but we're talking also about the absence of the ummah and the absence of mechanisms of shura in the public space in many of the writings talking about a virtuous Islamic society. Even our professors of maqasid, when I read what they are talking about, it's very static. They say حفظ الدين, حفظ النفس, حفظ العقل, حفظ العرض, etc. And they don't tell us how the public sphere should build a culture and nurture a culture that cherishes these maqasid. There is no clue. It's just as if it's a list, as if it's a geometrical map, as if it's a legal code. And this is actually the opposite of a moral theory in Islam. It's very dynamic, it's very personalized, and it's very much social. So this is also one of the dilemmas. So unless we reclaim again the moral agency of the individual and reclaim again the presence of the public sphere of Islam that consists of mustaftin, in the case of in the gaze of the alim, he sees people in terms of either receivers of knowledge or receivers of fatwa. But actually we are also moral agents, and we can also contribute to your own understanding and reformulate your own imagination if we insist on that, if we claim that we have questions, and sometimes even we want to negotiate our own self in the frame of the production of fatwa or the manufacturing of the fatwa. Here comes also a very important element that should be brought on the map of thinking, which is militarism. It's not anymore the issue of secularism and modernity and Islamism and democracy and the Arab uprising and failures, etc. It's about the rising presence of militarism globally. And here I go back to what Tariq Ramadan said at the very beginning in the conference. What do we have to offer the world? It's not only that we want to solve our own problems, but while doing so, we want actually to develop al-Bashariyah. We want to develop the globe at large. Does what we say make any sense for the globe? Do the questions we pose and the things that I just mentioned make any sense to someone who's not Muslim at all, who's a Christian, amongst the audience, for example? I think yes. 2001, Peter Mandeville wrote a very interesting book, or published a very interesting book that was talking about the emergence of the transnational sphere of the Ummah. Okay, 2007, Armando Salvatore, another person who is working within the realm of social sciences and focusing on the Muslim world, talked about going beyond the Westphalian understanding of politics because there is an emerging presence of the Ummah. The network society, the media, the cyberspace created this identity, especially after the Salman Rushdie affair and the rise of identity, especially in the UK, for example, of young Muslims, etc. So now we are witnessing a different understanding of the Muslim public sphere. We need to construct our own theory about understanding the Muslim public sphere, but also related to a more democratic theory that is, like Tariq Ramadan liked to call it, radical democratic understanding, putting justice in the forefront of our imagination and our claims. Ibn Khaldun was talking about al-mulk and the cycle of political orders, something that recently Fukuyama published about, a book about the political rise and or the political decay of political orders. But also interestingly, not only are we concerned about the public sphere, the corrosion of democracy and the corrosion of freedom and liberty in favor of more domination of the state, in favor of more militarism on the international level, but also Kissinger, in The World Order, the book that he published recently, talked about the issue of the Westphalian state and the Westphalian notion of nation state and territorial state. Give me just 1 minute. And the territorial state, but this also resonates to our dilemma. Did that territorial state in the Muslim world provided what it promised to provide? It didn't. And now it's decaying in the Arab world. So what is the alternative that we are not only providing the world, ourselves, but the world? And if you are following up what's going on in Europe, some scholars starting anticipating that Europe actually, though it looks so strong, it might eventually fall apart at a specific point if they can't agree on solving the disagreements that they are increasingly having, especially on the economic sphere, because all the time the notion of a cultural citizenship or a cultural identity of Europe has been debated. It was basically a political economic project, and the whole dilemma of culture was all the time there. How can we then go beyond asking the questions of an Islamic state, for good or for bad, with our good examples or with our bad examples, and go beyond the understanding of applying Sharia, that has been the slogan of many Islamic movements, to talk about an Islamic republic, to reclaim the presence of people, whether you call it republic, whether you call it shura, whether you call it presence of people, whether you call it rise of the public sphere, whether you call it our claim of resistance of whatever colonialism we are subject to, whether it's culture, whether it's military, whether it's economic, etc. I think these are the questions that we have to ask. And they are not actually different from the questions the muftis have to ask themselves, the degree of authority they are having, the presence of the political in their own context, and also the search for humanity in whatever future of Islam we aspire. Thank you.
شكرا لدكتورة هبة على هذه المداخلة التي أغنتني عفتني من بيان ترابطها في هذا السياق فأصبح من الواضح أنها تندرج في نفس الموضوع وإن كان هناك ترابط
there is a clear connection between what she said and what has been said by the earlier speaker as well. So she has spoken about the global dimension of the religious preference or authority, whereas the previous speaker spoke about the Mufti reference and authorities. So I will come back later with some comments. I would like now, without further ado, give the floor to the audience and open the floor for Q&A so that we listen to the way these speakers have been considered. So we start from the right, and the floor is given now to the speakers, to the audience.
Well, first of all, I would like to actually endorse what the lady just said, because we've been going through the situation in France last year. And we tried to step into the debate as Muslims because they asked us to do something about it before some books actually were given to the gender issue in the various schools. So the Muslim community wanted to step into the debate in France, and we were being clearly said that the children belong to the state and not to the parents. So I certainly endorse what the lady said. But I have a question to all the panelists, and more specifically to Dr. Brown. Dr. Brown, according to his biography, did talk about or did work transmission. And how can you do the difference? Which hadith should we accept? Because some scholars told us that if the transmission goes, well, is over 3 people. Well, some scholars said this was not okay. So it really is a matter of knowing how you can make the difference. And is it that we should believe into this? And the following quote was in Arabic.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. أن السؤال موجه للحضور جميعا. هل هناك منهجية معينة للشباب؟
For people, for the youth today, when they become more practice Islam, they do not find a specific authority, religious authority, a scientific authority they can use in order to find out more about the religion. Our friends here in Europe, for example, do you have an idea on how to sort out this issue? Is there a proposal to basically help the European youth who are looking for religious authorities? Because if they don't find any trustworthy, they go to the internet and they have what you call electronic authority. So what is the methodology that you would give to our youth? So can we be as brief as possible, please, and not be long, so that we give as much as time to the majority of people to take the floor. So one last person to take the floor now to raise a question.
Assalamu alaikum. في إطار قضية المفتي والمستفتي أظن أن هناك أزمة ثقة الآن بين
trust between the muftis and the people who require fatwas. Because these muftis are part of an institution now. In the past, at least in Morocco, we had the fatwa councils who were free, independent. They were not part of the government. But now that they are part of the governmental institutions, well, it has somehow lost that trust. For instance, in Egypt, so when we raise a question to the mufti in Egypt, with regard the Jordanian pilot. He said that terrorism is forbidden. Well, this is a general comment. I mean, we know what is happening in that part of the world. So, unless we explain this fully, well, laymen would no longer trust the muftis when they give such a shallow explanation. And this is a problem, a major issue. And as we all know, a lot of muftis do not meet all the criteria to make them reliable and trustworthy. And this is a major issue on a contemporary basis. We see that muftis today, they all have some kind of a wrapped up answer already. I mean, crystal clear. And this is a problem because there is no more thinking in it in order to provide fatwas. And that's a problem. Yes?
Excuse me? Yeah. I don't know what's the number here. 5, 6, yeah.
Salam alaikum. Merci pour vos brillantes interventions.
Thank you for those sterling presentations. In terms of legal opinions that are being given and the muftis who are authorized to do that, but what about taqlid? That is to say, this sort of blind belief in what they say because they've got the authority, they've got a science or a knowledge that we don't have. So as a scholar, as a student, how can you actually have a critical mind, and how can you have an absolute faith into the mufti? We are being told that we have to follow a certain school, but other institutions in France say, well, you can actually take a little bit from each school of thought. I mean, so what should be our position on this as students?
In the last, at the very end, yeah, in the middle.
Salam alaikum. Alors tout d'abord, je souhaiterais
First, I would like to thank all the panelists. It was really a very interesting panel. As a professor in Islamic religion, this issue of a reference is something that's very important to me because it touches upon the issue of transmission. And something I did notice in my students, among the younger ones, is when I tell them the history of the Prophet and the fact that he stayed in this whale for 3 days. I mean, pupils say to me, sir, how is that possible? And when I say, well, this is a divine miracle and God is sovereign in his creation, I mean, they look at me, but they don't look particularly convinced about what I say. But when I deal with issues such as the world of genes and so on and so forth, they are really very assertive as to the 4 ways of owning. So how can you be assertive for that and in doubt for the story about the whale? Do you know what they say to me? Yes, sir. But we saw the video.
Et alors, je tire une sonnette d'alarme.
We've seen the pictures. So I'm a bit worried now because I have this idea. I mean, I've got this feeling is that people think that what they see, what they hear, is what it means. Because when you see that the idea of a God who is sovereign in his creation doesn't have any meaning for the students, I'm worried. Because the meaning of Islam doesn't go or cannot be perceived through a video, can it? So what can you do?
At the very end, in the right side, please.
السلام عليكم ورحمة الله. سؤالي عن المرجعيات. متى نقول عن مرجعية ما انتهت صلاحيتها؟
When do we say that an authority is no longer trustworthy in Syria? We have, of course, ISIL, which is causing mayhem and havoc in the region, and they are destroying the shrines, and in the name of Allah, they destroy all these shrines. So how can we that a reference or an authority is valid or no longer valid? Thank you very much.
سأخذ هذه المداخلات أولا ثم نعود ل.
Okay, well, I will try to wrap this up now and answer the questions that have been raised. The first comment with regard to Dr. Heba. Would you like to answer now?
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. أنا هرد بالعربية عشان تعرفوا إن أنا بعرف أتكلم عربي.
Well, I will reply in Arabic so that you realize that I do speak Arabic in Egyptian speech. There was a question about how to understand scriptures. Well, as we said yesterday, knowledge is deconstructed now. It is fragmented now. So we need to come up with a methodology which is clear and cut in order to have an integral answer, an integrated answer to your question, whereas when it is fragmented as it is presented today, it is very difficult. You should have that curiosity in order to look at the sources that would enlighten you in your replies. And you need, of course, you need to have a minimum knowledge of the hadith, the traditions, and also the Quran. I myself, I have read a lot of the traditions of the Prophet, and therefore I have my perceptions and imagination is extremely dense about the perception of the Prophet, because I read a lot of it. Now, when we talk about weak traditions or confirmed traditions, well, I think it is important to have to look at the spirit, the soul of the text, and we need to know the Quran. We need to know the scriptures to have a full understanding. So it is important to have a grasp, a full grasp of the Quran. If there is a verse, if somebody uses the verse in order to justify, well, you need to be knowledgeable enough to find out, to basically separate the wheat from the chaff, as we say. And you need to have also a knowledge of the heritage and the different names, attributes of Allah, of God. You need to have knowledge about the Salafism and Sufism. That we need to have a direct link between you and the myriad of hadiths that are available. Well, Islam is not based on hadith. It is based on piety, on deep-rooted belief. A quick answer about the person who spoke about technology or the electronic references. Indeed, ITC, information and technology, have had an impact, and they are still having that on people who would resort to the technology in order to come up with an answer to their questions. And this is extremely important, and it has to be dealt with today. And Islamic thought has to deal with that. To what extent technology impacts the understanding of Muslims, and we need to find a way in order to shed light on this issue. Thank you very much, Madam Heba. Well, what Heba said about the hadith said, one of the companions said that it is very important to have the understanding that the traditions reflect the demeanor and the behavior of the Prophet.
Assalamu alaikum. There's a lot of questions. Je vais essayer de reprendre en français
and I shall try to answer some of those questions in French. Do you know what I believe is that we shouldn't actually read the hadith on our own, or rather only those, because if they are authentic, they are only pieces of data. So you can't actually read those books without a wider structure and a wider understanding that can be given by learned people and scholars. I'm saying this because if you read the Kitab from Tirmizi, you will see a chapter on hadith that say, well, this is what you should do, right? The next chapter, don't do this. So you see, those are the specificities on which scholars work in order to have a response and an answer.
Torture it in French is that if yeah, I tried. Thank you. So my mom would be proud of me. The point is that with hadith also you have to really be modest. This is very important. I spent many years of my life laughing at hadith and hadith are so stupid. And then you know, as you become more learned, you realize that you don't know everything in the world. I don't know everything in the world. And a lot of times you read a hadith and it seems silly, and then you understand something and it doesn't seem silly, or you realize you were thinking about it in the wrong way. So I think it's, my suggestion is don't concern yourself too much with hadith without scholars to explain them. But if you do, have husn al-dhan in hadiths, because you don't know everything. فَوْقَ كُلِّ ذِي عِلْمٍ عَلِيمٍ. And concernant Ibn Taymiyyah, je crois qu'il... أفتكر أن الأخ كان يتكلم عن ابن تيمية في أنه مرجع انتهى صلاحيته. هل هذا ابن تيمية؟
Were you referring to Ibn Taymiyyah? I think one of the questions about Daesh, and you were referring to Ibn Taymiyyah.
غير صحيح.
Well, this is untrue, completely untrue. So if you want to look for a fatwa that would say it is licit for a man to go to a war and get herself killed and to volunteer in this case, well, there Ibn Taymiyyah is the one who gave that fatwa, and he said Ibn Taymiyyah, he only represents the Hanbali thought of school specifically, and it is not a widespread authority or reference, especially with regard to burning somebody or the immolation of the Jordanian pilot, as it happened lately in and committed by the Islamic State of the Levant and Iraq. So I hope that you are not to look at to consider this fatwa as being accepted and widespread.
السؤال كان عن متى تنتهي يمكن أن نقول أن هذه المرجعية انتهت صلاحيتها.
Was about the authority. When can we say that an authority is no longer valid? That was the question.
يعني هو بحسب القضية التي يسأل فيها أو تطرح.
Depending on the context of the question, the modern Mufti bases himself on the Islamic thought, Islamic heritage. Now, the Mufti should be able to read properly the scriptures and also the heritage, and should be distinguished and make sure that he highlights what goes in line with modern situations. And this is Al-Qaradawi has said. He said that we need to have a selective jurisprudence, a selective independent legal reasoning, and we may find things from our heritage that are in line and they are in conformity of our today's standards. So we are requested to come up with independent legal reasoning and also some jurisprudence in order to come up with solutions to solve today's dilemmas. We need to have a comprehensive view, and we need to base ourselves on our heritage, but not as such, but we build upon it in order to come up with a modern interpretation. I mean, this applies to all the sciences. I mean, there is some kind of a capitalization on our achievements that we had in the past in order to give them a modern touch. There has been two questions with regards to the methodology to learn more about religion. And there was another question, how can laymen distinguish between what is licit and illicit? Now, with regard to, I mean, how would a layman choose between Mufti A and Mufti B, or different schools of thought? There are criteria, and there are criteria that people should know about. And these criteria, this is what Mr. Ahmed has said. Allah said, do refer to people who are knowledgeable if you don't know. The second criteria is that the Mufti should be from the same country. This is extremely important. And all those who have written about the essence of fatwa have focused on this issue, that the Mufti should be from the very country, because Al-Mufti, basically what he does is he reasons, he tries to give independent legal reasoning on a specific context, on complicated issues. Even culture plays a real role in the way we understand things, on the way we perceive things. I myself, I heard someone on TV, and there was a question from Italy to that Mufti, and that Italian was from Morocco, and he said, my wife has poisoned me. She has used some kind of she has done some witchcraft on me. And the Mufti was listening to that, and he said, is your wife listening to us? He said, yes. So I said, I will reply to her directly. So he replied to the spouse. He said, you dear spouse, your husband asked you to prepare his food, and because he wanted to break his fasting, and you did not prepare food for him in order to break his food. So he misunderstood. So the Mufti did not understand the word suhoor, which is witchcraft. He understood it as being the name of the meal that you provide when you break the Ramadan, when you break the fasting. So there was a misunderstanding because the context was not the same. This is on an individual person, let alone when we talk on a macro level, on a nation's level. So if there are misunderstandings between the Muftis, well, that's a major issue. For example, if I give if I myself gave fatwas about the personal family law, I mean, cultures differ. I mean, this is really beating a dead horse, because we cannot answer, we cannot give fatwas which are from which are away from the context, for example. We need to know the context, to know the reality, to be able to provide a fatwa. So there is a problem, and therefore we need, that's why I say we need to refer to institutions, because if we refer to individuals, they are more likely to make mistakes, whereas an institution has got a legal framework. In these councils of Ifta, for example, they discuss a lot. When there is a little issue which is complicated, well, it takes sometimes 2 years before they come up with the fatwa, because we think about it. Whereas if we refer to an individual mufti, then of course a mufti would never tell you, oh, I don't know. No, muftis on television, they always have the answer to every single question that is raised. One last thing, with regard to the school of thought, do we follow one or two school of thoughts? There are two parts here. There is part of the fiqh that links you to Allah, to God directly. And then you have to choose the school of thought of your choice and do not refer to any school of thought. This is when we talk about the linkages between you and your creator, and therefore the other parties have no reference at all. Because when we refer to the ties between you and the people, then today, in the European context, we cannot refer to one single school of thought. We have Hanbali, Shafi'i, we have many schools of thought, and therefore we need to refer to the institution for the fatwas. Thank you very much.
كلمة سريعة قبل أن أنتقل إليكم حول مسألة ما أشير حول داعش. بما أنني كتبت دراسة عن هذا الأمر مجرد الاستشهاد ببعض النصوص. أنا قرأت النصوص الأصلية لفقهاء ما يسمون فقهاء داعش.
Verses refers to them. I did look at this. The fact that they mention some kind of a verse, it doesn't mean that Daesh really uses that verse in order to explain their behaviors or justify their behavior. In fact, they use or misuse some of the verses, and they interpret them in order to serve their own interests and their own agendas. And sometimes they even refer to some tribal interpretations. And Jonathan Brown has written a book about the misquoting Mohammed, one of the latest releases from Brown, and he has shed light on this very issue. Back to the floor, the audience. So here in the middle.
أرجو أن تكون الأسئلة مختصرة ومباشرة
والإجابات أيضا مختصرة. Please make sure the questions are to the point, concise, and the answers as well. My question is to Dr. Becheri. In your speech, you spoke about the institutions. My question is, how do modern Islamic institutions work in order to crystallize the thought to be presented to the Muslims, and how do they work in terms of the curricula that is taught at schools? For example, we in the Arab world, we do have some curricula that dates back to the 19th century. We haven't come to the situation where we update them. The floor is to another speaker, because one of you have asked for the floor some time ago, and we should give him the floor now. Peace be upon you all. A question to Dr. al-Becheri with regard to the collective ijtihad or the collective independent legal reasoning. Well, jurists today have accepted this collective approach, but this is in principle. Now, there is a problem of these, the collectivity. Does it mean that many jurists meet together in an association to issue a ruling, a fatwa? Now, with regard to the experts, how do we select those experts and specialized? Does it mean that they have to have degrees, they have studied the scriptures, etc.? Now, what are the criteria to select them? Now, if we have jurists who do not have a scientific basis, do we still vet them as being a reference, yes or no? Because to be specialized is sometimes important, but we need to have also the question of reputation. Renowned, are those people renowned and known enough? One last question, if I may, in the same context. Bear with me, please, just one more second. When we talk about the jurists and the specialized people, or is it important to look at what the people need to know? Because the context differs from one country to another, from one continent to another, because the situations differ as well for the Muslim communities living abroad.
In the middle, at the very end, yeah. Yes.
Good morning. Thank you for those extremely interesting presentations. I would like to go back to what Karl Popper said. I mean, I don't know whether you know him, but he's a scientist. He is from Austria, and he always insists a lot on consistency. Consistency, that's the word. Now, consistency is something that can be falsified, quite logically, because scientific theories have developed and evolved. So I would like to, maybe I'm not expressing myself properly, says the speaker, but this, between the Mufti and the people, there should be some consistency in terms of opinions. And there is something else as well. And I would like to answer the gentleman there on the right. But today, with the communication means that we have, we destructure the mind and the things, and it makes people mentally inconsistent, and that provokes so many issues in our modern society, to my mind anyway. Thank you.
The lady.
Salam alaikum. Je tenais à remercier tous les professeurs et docteurs
all the panelists who are here today and were here yesterday. I have a question for Dr. Tariq Ramadan. After the Charlie Hebdo event, you were invited by Thierry Ardisson. He asked you a question, and that was the following question: does the divine law prevail on the law of the Republic? And your answer said that, well, you did say that the law of the Republic prevails on the divine law. Could you provide us with a few explanations on this? Thank you.
Can I ask my question? Or
okay.
Sorry. That's called militarism. Sorry. The image that is painted thus far by the four respected panelists here and seems to be one quite bleak, and I don't know if everybody agrees with me that it is somewhat apathetic. because it's portraying an image of a battle of authority between the political authorities and the religious authorities in shaping and controlling public discourse. Public discourse through which they themselves derive their authority, as Jonathan mentions. This leaves us in a place of apathy. The masses, who do they really turn to? We give authority to those who are in political power, and we also accept or reject the authority of the religious elite. How can we have an ijtihad today? How can we have an ijtihad that is free from the influence of the politicians or of other commercial players? That's the question.
شكرا. طبعا هذا أخذ المايك بالتغلب.
طيب, so sorry. That was an interesting question, and we give the floor to the person here on the second row.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Vorrei per primo ringraziare عفوا ليس هناك مترجمون. بداية لابد أن أشكر حقيقة
Well, to begin with, I would like to extend my thanks to the CILE and also the European Muslim Network in Brussels for having so kindly organized this event. And indeed, yesterday, there were some differences in the opinions, and this is fantastic to have people who have different opinions, because this is a very good principle. I mean, it is not only among Muslims, but among all communities. This is part of who we are, of human beings. We need to be different. We have to respect the others, and we have to reject violence and reject hate speech and be able to bear the others' opinions. Well, a little comment with regard to the fatwa. Well, there is a link between the Mufti and the people who look for fatwas. Then we need to have a conviction. Sometimes a fatwa is not convincing, and even the Prophet, peace be upon him, told us that. I mean, sometimes when you ask a question to somebody, a Mufti will tell you it is licit or illicit. That's it, clear and cut. And that is not convincing. This is what I wanted to say.
Okay, in the middle, please. Okay, well, I will return back to his question, inshallah. Yeah, in the middle, please. Okay. Okay. Go ahead, please.
والله أشكر الإخوة على الإجابات.
لكن السؤال الذي طرحته given, but my question has not been answered to. There is a question about the methodology. I mean, is there a way we have a written methodology that would be put on the internet so that people know what is the procedure, what is the reference?
Yeah.
Assalamu alaikum. Moi, je voulais savoir, en fait,
I wanted to know something. Is it that today, do we have an institution in Europe to whom I could go in order to obtain some answers about our life in Europe with, in Islam?
In the middle, please. In the middle, please. There.
En fait, c'est simplement pour une petite question.
I had a very brief question in order to relate to this political or religious reference, and this is also related to the last presentation. The majority of fatwas we are being faced with today are coming from television channels, from the Gulf, and you can see that they are mainly political. How do you feel about the value of those messages? Because I think there are often some afterthoughts there. Whether it is Al Jazeera, I mean, the beginning was highly profitable for the Muslim population. It was a good thing, beneficial for the Muslim population. In the last few years, it's a bit more regrettable. But, I mean, you can see that sometimes there is a political afterthought in those fatwas that are being delivered by those television channels or on the web.
Thank you very much. So we'll attempt to answer the questions. And I'm not going to answer the last question because I was dealing with it on the Al Jazeera. There was a question to Heba Becheri with regard to the work of the institutions, the role of the institutions. A question also about the collective ijtihad or fiqh, or jurisprudence. Well, with regard to the institutions, I meant the religious institutions that are in charge of communicating religious messages, training of imams, or providing religious curriculum. This is what I refer to. These institutions are in their infancy, and they will grow, hopefully, and become more mature, and hopefully that they are going to meet the very highest standards. But in order to institutionalize religious issues, well, we need to be convinced of that. We need to be convinced of that because everything has to go through institutions. We have a long way to go, and we have to be convinced and accept that as a fact in order to create the legal framework so that we reach to a modern, reliable, trustworthy institutions. This is a duty. It's a duty. There is no. It's not an option, and I think this is in the interest of everybody. If we want to safeguard religion, because we are all responsible of that, and because normally the central government is the one in charge of safeguarding religion. If we don't have such institution, it is our responsibility all as a collectivity in order to create the optimal framework to guarantee the Quran. Now, with regard to the ijtihad or the independent legal reasoning, how can we come to that? With regard to the councils of ijtihad, they all rely on the experts. I think we should go beyond that. I think that experts should not be advisors, but they should be members of the council, and they should be knowledgeable of the scriptures themselves, because this is very important if we look at the competences and the skills that are required to be a member of these council of ifta, because there are thousands of questions that are raised to these ijtihad councils and fiqh councils. So if we look at the number of issues that are raised, they are endless, countless, and the jurist needs to exert their utmost in order to look at the scriptures in light of the modern times. And therefore, these experts should not only be advisors only, but they should be full-fledged members, and they have to be, they should be knowledgeable, and this is needed. If we look at this issue, when we look at the cryptocurrencies, for example, the riba and the sale riba, what is licit and illicit. There are discrepancies. We need to have a uniform approach, bearing in mind that it is important sometimes to have to leave room to some kind of differences. When we talk about the people, about the Muslims, the community themselves, they need also to be held responsible. And also the scholars need to provide the proper services. But that does not disclaim, that does not allow Muslims to rely only on fatwa. They should be knowledgeable enough themselves. Dr. Jaballah, there are two questions about the Europe, whether there is an institution, etc.
Question de méthodologie.
In terms of methodology, I think that there are essays. Things have been said by Muslim thinkers in French. And the other thing is, and this is very important, there is an evolution in terms of study centers, and they actually teach imams, preachers, and they also teach non-specialists. So for a Muslim who wants to actually enrich his Muslim culture, it's always good to follow a training or a certain type of education that will actually enable him afterwards to have a critical mind about this multiplicity of legal opinions. Yes, and in order to answer your question, yes, it is a richness, but sometimes in the name of diversity, you can go too far. You have to try to focus on what we have in common in order to have a common ground that is actually more solid, whilst being in a culture of diversity. As to this question about this institution you can turn towards in Europe, I think that the experience of the European Council of Fatwas is a very good experience. This council that actually produced several legal advices is actually being studied in various universities, and but its work is not sufficiently known. That's unfortunate. So, I mean, we do have things. Those things exist, and we are going to do our best in order to have it better communicated and translated. We've got a website in Arabic, but there are some projects in the pipeline in order to develop those opinions in other languages. As to fatwas and television channels, I think we have to pay some tribute to ETRA, the channel in French. I hasten to say, for the last 2 years, they actually give the floor in French to theologians living in Europe. With my colleague, we joined into quite a few programs. We registered a program a couple of weeks ago. There are other programs in the pipeline, but it's in French because there is a train in Arabic. But in French, yes, I mean, they do things, and we have to pay tribute to what they do, and we have to actually try to benefit from what they do.
Thank you, Dr. Jaballah. Dr. Heba, there is a question regarding the religious reference and the political religious and the question about the satellites channels. I think this has got a political dimension, and he spoke about the governments that are financing some of the channels which are trying to create some kind of a framework for these channels. Well, I don't know if my colleagues on the rostrum will accept or not my my position with regard to the Islam online and the fatwa fatwas that come through Islam Online. And I think it is extremely important for Muslims to do their best, to exert all their efforts and go to the end of the world to come up with the right fatwas and not be satisfied with the least that is given to him. So we need to refer to Al-Azhar, it's true, and we should find out what are the characteristics that a mufti should have. For me, it is important to have this direct link, a direct link between the mufti and the person who seeks the fatwas. And this is the scholars' positions. It is important to have this common link, direct link, because when you speak directly to a person face to face, where there is this chemistry that characterizes this type of relationship. That is what we call al-baraka. And in this setting where a mufti is providing information to the person seeking fatwas, if we can't have this situation, well, obviously, we should be able to accept other alternatives. For example, Skype. Skype is very important and compared to a text fatwa because there is some kind of interaction, and this is important for all of us in order to build this confidence. And a mufti should be honest enough, and he should not be giving those fatwas just to serve his agenda, his fame, and his situation. No, he should be committed enough in order to provide those fatwas to serve people, and should not be leading, should not be seeking some kind of a position, or some kind of capital or money or self-interest. He should be serving the people who are handing him the questions. And it is indeed sometimes very difficult to come to a source that satisfies you in terms of answers. But and this is precisely what I reiterate my request to all the people to look for science, to dig for science in order to have enough culture to be able. Otherwise, if we rely only on other people, that is not enough. It is important to have dedicated channels. This is possible in order to have live questions and answers with dedicated channels, dedicated experts, and fatwas. But I mean, this idea of shopping online for fatwas, this has to be stopped because it doesn't work. It doesn't serve properly the interests of the people and the Muslims at large.
دكتورة هبة سؤال على
A question to Dr. Heba on Twitter from Qamar Noor.
Necessarily remove moral authority from an individual?
I mean, the nation state claimed to be a moral agent. It doesn't have to if you don't accept it. If you refuse, if you reject this, and you keep your moral agency because you believe that it's not only about this time, but it's also about the day of judgment. كلكم آتيه يوم القيامة فردا. لا هجيب معايا لا حزب ولا جماعة ولا دولة ولا مواطنة ولا. I have to keep my moral agency. I have to do things that I believe in, and if necessary, that's what opposition is about. That's what contestation of the authority that is not, might is not right. يعني just keep that in mind. Might is not right, and I don't have to accept any authority that I consider to be doing things that are immoral under any theory, even if this theory is a theory of sovereignty, a theory of the obedience to the ruler coming from a religious perspective or whatever. I mean, I think that it's not about the choice of the individual, it's about the situation that you are finding yourself in, and hence it's your decision to accept or to say no. And this is what in the Quran, the Quran is going along two lines basically, أشهد ولا أشهد, قل لا أشهد. And as much as we are in the Islam doing a lot of shahada, we are doing a lot of counter shahad as well. So in some of the verses of the Quran, قل لا أشهد, I will not be a witness of injustice.
Okay. سريعا بس لأنه لازم نختم.
Quickly, please. Well, I spoke in French, and maybe my colleague has not understood me. Well, what I did say that in Europe we have institutions, so this is the solution. We need to guide the youth to these institutions in order to have a collective and institutional answer to their queries. It's a major challenge we're facing today, because this is the easy way out. People would go spontaneously to the online searches, and a lot of people ignore the existence of these institutions, and therefore I would call upon all the policymakers in Europe in order to sensitize the people about these institutions that are there. One last thing to wrap up. I will refer to something, little information. I was working on the Sharia and Hayat program on Al Jazeera until 2013. I was the animator. All the topics that have been dealt with, I am responsible for them. I can be held accountable. Nobody, during the last years when I was serving that program, nobody told me or dictated on me the way I would deliver the messages. I was fully in charge for the 9 years. So the political establishment did not interfere in my work. If I got it right, well, that's good. If I made a mistake, well, it's my responsibility. This is something I wanted to say to all of you. Now, to wrap up this morning session, I would like to make a couple of comments quickly. Well, we have Dr. Tariq has spoken a lot. Well, 4 papers have been delivered this morning. The first one from Dr. Jaballah, who spoke about the reference, the authority, and he has spoken about this Islamic heritage, and he has spoken also about his expertise and his experience in the European context. Jonathan Brown has spoken to us about the fatwa, whether it is going to be accepted, not accepted, the strength of it, the interpretation of it, and the fact that we should go back to the scriptures, and also the role of people, whether they accept and not accept the fatwa, and the political dimensions. Dr. Becheri has spoken about the fatwa, the way it is organized, and he said that the overwhelming majority of the fatwas should be properly conveyed to the people depending on the needs, on their specific needs. He has also spoken about the lack of context. A lot of people do give fatwas without bearing in mind the real context and the facts of life. Dr. Heba Raouf has spoken about a methodological approach that should be put in place in order to deliver those fatwas, either an institution or as a government. Indeed, in these papers that have been delivered, especially from Dr. Heba and Jonathan Brown, there was a focus about the fatwa and the way it is made up, how it is constructed, and also spoken about the religious authority, that this is constructed and it is not a hierarchy. There is an interaction between the Mufti and the reality and the person who asks for the fatwas. So there is some kind of an interaction between the 3 parties which make up ultimately the religious reference and authority. There shouldn't be this hierarchy from the top to the bottom. I thank you very much for the speakers, for the 4 speakers who have taken the floor: Dr. Heba Raouf Ezzat, Dr. Alarbi Becheri, Dr. Jonathan Brown, and Dr. Ahmed Jaballah. Thank you very much for having delivered your speeches.
The clap is a good sign. Alhamdulillah, we are coming to the end of this session, and we would like to extend our thanks to the panelists and our colleague, Dr. Mu'taz, the moderator. We will break. We are also honored to have with us Professor Karen Armstrong. She will be speaking to you this afternoon, inshallah. So on behalf of you, I welcome her now. And then again, I will introduce her later on. Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, we'll break for an hour or so for lunch and prayers, and we'll resume back to follow our program, inshallah. Thank you. See you later.